Chris Ferris Show. Well, welcome back to the Chris Ferris Show. Glad you guys are with us today. Going to be talking about today, how do we move beyond and past resentments? How many of you watching this right now, you have lived a life, or you know what it's like to have deep resentments to somebody that you loved, you trusted, somebody that you brought into your life, somebody that you made yourself vulnerable to. Something happened, something was violated, and now you're living with those resentments. This is not an original statement to me. I'm sure you've heard it before, nothing new or groundbreaking here. But somebody once said that holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die. I think that is a great analogy of what resentments do to us, because resentments are really nothing more than sort of that spiritual, emotional cancer that just eats away at us until we feel emotionless, we feel dead inside. And just, of course, as we say often on this show, it leads us to the opposite of the life that God has called us into, the opposite of the abundant life. I want to say this, and I try to say this whenever we talk about sensitive matters and sensitive subjects like this, that I don't ever want you to think that we are being insensitive to the trauma and to the things that you walked through in your life, or the things that you went through. Because I know that some of you have experienced significant things in your life, and you've had people come against you in a significant way. And we never want to downplay that. But I do want to make a statement, and I have said this before in many different settings, and we say this from a place of love. But being a victim is not a choice. Staying a victim is. Being a victim is not a choice, but staying a victim is. And one of the things that we want to do, one of the reasons that we take time to have these conversations, because we want you to learn how to step out of that victim role. A lot of times, people stay in the victim role because it gives them an excuse to continue to point the finger at everybody else around them, so they don't have to take personal responsibility for themselves. So again, you've been hurt, you've had things come against you, you hold deep and profound resentments. I totally get it and understand. But you don't have to stay there. The encouraging word today is that there is life beyond that resentment, and you have the power to move beyond it. So we're going to do this in two parts. This is just going to be part one. Today we're going to talk about, where do resentments come from? What do they lead us to? Where do the resentments come from in our life? Why do we have them, and where do they take us? When we don't remove them from our life, when we don't transcend them, rise above them, move beyond them, where do they actually take us? I think it's important that we see that first before we actually talk about how we move beyond them. So let's take some time to identify where these resentments come from. We know that resentments are predicated on expectations that were not met, or failed expectations. Now, sometimes these expectations were unrealistic, but many times they weren't unrealistic expectations. In fact, I believe that that's where the most profound resentment comes from. This expectation that was realistic, that was agreed upon, or that was just sort of an unspoken reality, went unmet or was violated. I believe that's where some of the most profound resentments in our life come from. But this is a really important part of this conversation, that a lot of times that unmet expectation is identified in what we call emotional trauma. There was something traumatic that came into your life. You were violated by a parent. You were rejected, or you were abandoned by a mom, by a father. You were sexually abused by somebody that you trusted or somebody that you loved. You were cheated on in a relationship. There was an expectation of faithfulness and this monogamous relationship, but then you were cheated on, right? And so that created an incredible wound for you. Here's what we want to establish right off the bat here in this conversation. That if you do not heal from the ones who cut you, you're going to bleed on the ones who didn't. In fact, the saying goes that hurt people, and I don't care how much you want to argue with it. It's just a fact. Hurt people, hurt people. And so if you do not come to the place where you begin to inventory and evaluate the past hurts and trauma that you've experienced in your life, you're going to be that person who goes on hurting other people. And so how do we deal with this? How do we manage this? Well, first we identify it. We have to identify it. So let me give you an illustration here that I think will be practical. It's a little heavy, but I think it'll be practical. I think it's a practical analogy that will help you understand how the brain works when it comes to this trauma and where these resentments come from. If I were to take a knife and I were to pull my sleeve back and I were to cut my arm on video here, I really got into it. I really cut it. My arm is going to open up and it's going to begin to bleed. You're going to see it bleed out on camera. Now, there's a physiological signal that is sent to my brain when this happens, and that physiological signal is that the first signal is coagulate the blood. Right, we're going to coagulate the blood so that it doesn't. We don't bleed out. Right, that's a signal that the brain sends. Stop the bleeding. Another signal that is sent from the brain is begin scabbing, build scabbing around that wound. What's the purpose of a scab? Well, the purpose of a scab is to protect us from from germs and invasion, outside invasion coming in and hurting, infecting that cut. And then there's another signal that the brain sends, and that is begin to build scar tissue. Well, what does scar tissue do? It literally keeps us from being cut that same way, in that same manner, or in that same spot. It's a protective mode to keep us from being wounded that way again. Psychologists and science shows us that our brain has a very similar response to emotional trauma and emotional wounds that we experience. And let me explain to you. If you go through something traumatic, let's pretend, let's just use the illustration, and you'll have to contextualize this for your life. But let's just use the illustration between a husband and a wife. And let's pretend that a husband and wife came together, they fell in love, and they had an incredible relationship, and they promised faithfulness to one another, and it wasn't some open relationship, but they were to be faithful to one another. There was an expectation of faithfulness. Well, in that conversation or in that narrative is where we begin to open up our hearts. We begin to trust. We become vulnerable. They don't just know us or see us at a surface level. They know the deepest, most intimate parts about our life. And let's pretend or assume that at some point in that relationship, somebody decided, let's assume the husband decided to step out and to cheat, to have a mistress or to have an affair on his wife. Well, when his wife finds out, and you're incredibly insane to think that you're going to be able to do that long term without somebody finding out. But let's assume that when his wife finds out, immediately something happens. She experiences wounds. She's been cut deeply. She's been cut emotionally. Well, the very first thing that happens, the first reaction of her brain is to project anger and resentment. It provides, when she looks at you, she says to her husband, I resent you. I hate you for what you've done. You violated our boundaries. You violated the sanctity of our marriage. I resent you for this. Well, here's what resentment does. Resentment provides significance to the pain. If you please, much like in the physiological sense, there is coagulation of blood. Resentment is sort of that emotional coagulation. If I hate you, if I resent you, I can stop this bleeding. And so resentment is going to be found in that trauma, that wound, that expectation that went unmet. But that resentment doesn't just stop at resentment. It begins to develop, it begins to foster, it grows and matures, and it's constructed into the next phase of what we call fear. Fear is the defense mechanism, if you please, just like the physiological scabbing is the defense mechanism of the body to keep outside germs and things from coming in and invading the body. That's what fear does. We move into a defense mode. We become fearful to trust. We become fearful to be vulnerable again. I made myself vulnerable. It backfired on me. You lied, you cheated, and now I'm terrified to do it. So we live in a defense mode, right? That is sort of the emotional scabbing. I have to protect myself from being hurt that way again. And then when that fear is fully developed, it becomes what we call the behavior or pattern. We'll refer to this as the emotional scar tissue. What happens is a person begins to develop a behavior that says, I'm not going to ever allow myself to be in that type of situation again. In fact, I'm going to create or build or construct some emotional scar tissue that never allows me to fully trust again or to fully be vulnerable. In fact, what ends up happening, that behavior turns into a pattern for that person. They begin to sabotage relationships. People will get close to them. They start to feel vulnerable again. They start to feel fearful again, and they'll sabotage the relationship because in their mind, I'll hurt you before you hurt me. And so what I want you to understand about this resentment and the resentments that we carry, that it's not just, I hate you for what you've done. It literally becomes fully developed and matured. It literally becomes the behaviors and the patterns that we have in life. Now, here's the deal. You have to contextualize this because for many of us, it's not something in a relationship, present day relationship, we were cheated on. Some of these emotional wounds and the trauma that we carry go all the way back to our childhood. Goes all the way back to our social construct, the people that were in our lives, our parents, violations of our parents, sexual abuse, physical abuse, abandonment, rejection. It goes all the way back to our childhood. Here's what you need to understand in the first part of this conversation. These resentments, this trauma doesn't heal on its own. These resentments do not just magically go away. In other words, you can't fix this on your own. You have to bring somebody into the conversation who can help direct this process and help you identify these things in your life and who can be there with you, because some of these thoughts, some of these memories that you're going to access in your memory indexer it's going to be painful. It's going to bring up other memories and feelings that can cause us to move into situational depression. You should get with somebody who can help walk you through this process, a good therapist, psychologist, a mental health coach. But you also need to understand that if you don't do something about it, regardless, and I hear people say this to me all the time, the famous words, I'm totally over that. I've gotten over that. I've forgiven them. I moved on. I'm totally over it. And then I begin to unpack their life and we begin to look at behaviors and patterns that they have in their life, and we reverse engineer from those behaviors and patterns and just back to the trauma, and we discover they're not really over it. In fact, it's still very much there. What they've done is they've suppressed the memory of it, and it sort of moves to the subconscious, but it creates and constructs these character defects in us that sit at the most subconscious part of our brain and begin and end up controlling the most conscious parts of our life. And so the challenge is this, and the first part of this is what we call this process of identification. I'm inventorying and I'm identifying. Do I have some behaviors and patterns that are not healthy, that are destructive? Am I that person who sabotages relationships? Do I play the game of catch and release? If you get too close, I release you. If you get too far away, I try to reel you back in. Am I terrified to trust? Or am I terrified to be vulnerable or to open up? Are there some behaviors and patterns that are destructive to my life and the people around me? And then we go back and say, well, what fear is that rooted in? What am I afraid of? What am I fearful of? What is the fear that is driving that behavior and that pattern? And once we identify the fear, then we can go back and say, well, let's talk about what this fear is rooted in. What's the catalyst to this fear? That is where you discover that real resentment that you're holding. And then, of course, we attach that to the trauma that we've experienced. And so in the first part of this, all we're doing is what we're calling an identification process. We're identifying where it is. We see the trauma, we see the resentment, we see the fear, we see the behavior and the pattern. And the Part two of this, we're going to have a conversation about how do we rise above it? Is it possible to move beyond those resentments? Is it possible to be able to transcend them, to rise above them, to live life without them? Is it possible to change the behaviors and patterns to eliminate the fear? The answer is absolutely yes. And so we'll talk about that in part 2. But in this process, evaluate, and let's take some time to identify. God bless. We'll see you next time.